Right. In the interest of time, I think we can get started. Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this evening. So the webinar that we have this evening is on manuscript writing and publishing for impactful research. And then this will be led by Nathan Singano and Ackim Bwanali. So this is Ackim Bwanali speaking. So I think I will hand over the floor to Nathan to get started. So Nathan, you can start by introducing yourself and then you can get started.
Right. Thank you, Akim. Hi, everyone. So my name is Nathan Singano. I'm a public health researcher at CREAMS, and I'll be sharing a little bit about manuscript writing. Akim, if you could just perhaps, okay, let me see if I can share the slides.
Yes, Nathan, you're the host now.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we'll be sharing about manuscript writing and publishing for impactful research. And the objectives of this session will be to provide guidance to established authors or upcoming authors on how to write a good manuscript. But I would like to bring a perspective from the reviewer side, because a part of publishing, you get published with reviewers to look at your work. So reviewers are part of the publishing process in that these are your colleagues. They might be experts in the field, people that are subject experts in the field that you are going to publish in. So when you submit your manuscript to a journal, they'll usually select 3, depending with the journal, reviewers who are going to review your paper, and then they'll give you comments. So just as an overview, usually journals, they have this IMRAG format, which is an introduction or a background, and then the methods, what you exactly did, your results, what you found, and taking it all together, what that exactly means. So reviewers, they'll first look at your abstract, which is like a summary of your work, right? So it's usually like maybe 350 words, depending with the journal, or sometimes 200 or 250. And they're going to look things like, is the aim clear? Why are you doing this study? Was it really necessary? And is it clear what you find, what you were able to find? And is it informative and relative? So to the public health sector, and I'll assume that since we're here, most of us are from CREAMS, I'm going to assume that most of us are in the public health sector or related sectors. So they're going to look at the relevance of your study to say, is this relevant to the public health? If somebody is reading this paper, are they going to benefit something from this? So this is just like a summary, the abstract, and usually it might be even just the last section of your paper to write, because it has like the results, and a little bit of the conclusions. So for the introduction, reviewers want to establish, like they want to see from your paper what you have written. Is it already known, right? Because you can't write something out of nowhere. You have to start somewhere where somebody has already found something or they already have an idea. So they want to see that, have you really cited some studies which were done, or some big experts or people that have already established in that field, right? So in every country or even in every sector, there might be people who are well known. Let's say maybe if you talk about mental health, they know that there's Professor so in Malawi specializes in mental health. You know, they've already published a number of studies in this area. So reviewers might look to say, okay, what's really the situation in Malawi? For instance, you've done a study in Malawi, and is the research question clearly outlined? Or is the research question justified given to what is already known? Because they have to clearly indicate the gap in your study. You know, you can't just do like repetitions of studies that have already been done somewhere. There have to be novelty in what you are doing, right? So you have to clearly describe why in the introduction, why this research is important. Because if I open your paper, the first thing I'm going to read is the abstract, right? And if I'm interested in the abstract, I'm going to read secondly the introduction. So the introduction should be enticing enough for somebody to continue reading, to say, okay, this is actually the gap that's there, and this is what they're proposing to do. You know, because when you're writing, you write in reference to, like, you're identifying the problem statement, where like you describe the ideal situation, then you describe what's happening on the ground, and then you describe the gap and what you're proposing to do to bridge the gap. So that's about the introduction. So for the methods, now you are describing, okay, this is what we propose to do, and this is how we actually did it. So, you know, like usually we have two main types of methods. That's going to be like quantitative and qualitative, right? So from there, people want to see that what you have done, the most important thing is, can it be replicated? Because sometimes I see people maybe on study design, they'll say, we did a quasi-experimental study design, you know, we did a social study design, but what does that actually mean to someone who is reading, right? So you can say we did a cross-sectional study, but what does that really mean? You can just say, okay, we did a cross-sectional study with a survey, something like that. So that when somebody is reading what you are saying, they're able to follow through, like, okay, so yes, it was a cross-sectional study, yes, and then but what exactly did they do? They did a survey. Or no, maybe it was a systematic review, or maybe it was a qualitative study. They did maybe focus groups or things like that. And then from there, for instance, in quantitative studies, you have to clearly define the variables and how they were measured. So we're talking about, if you're going to do, now that's like the data analysis part, if you're going to do maybe some descriptive statistics, if you're going to do inferential statistics, things like that. Maybe some migrations, what were the variables that you were looking for? Maybe you're doing a gap study. How are you going to define what is knowledge? How are you going to define what is attitude? How are you defining practice? Or maybe you're looking at an outcome of a certain disease. How do you define maybe exposure? How do you define what an outcome is from your study? Because depending with the context, things might be a little bit different, right? So you have to clearly define according to your study what you did, you know, and then you also, as much as you might do things differently, they have to be validated methods and they have to be reliable. So reviewers want to see whether, if you are doing a questionnaire, was it pre-tested first? Is it reliable? Has this questionnaire been used somewhere else? And then does it actually answer your question? Because I've seen sometimes you might have a certain design, but it's failing to answer the question of your study. you know. So you have to make sure that all those areas that are properly addressed. So yeah, so if you are going in, let's say maybe in quantitative methods, you could also mention about your population, sample size calculation, how you did that. And yeah, I've touched already about the equipment and questionnaires. So yeah, like I said, the most important thing is that if somebody is reading this manuscript, they should be able to replicate whatever you did. And I see sometimes people are they're not really forthcoming with how they did certain things in their method section. And that's a little bit limiting, because if you do a good job, somebody might also do the same study somewhere else, and they're going to cite your work because they're going to say, in the discussion, they're going to discuss that, okay, according to so in Malawi, they found something different. We have also done the same thing, we have found something different. So you have to be very forthcoming with what you did and how you did it. And then obviously, when you're writing in past tense. Yeah. So for the results, I think Akim uh, will continue from here, and then I'll come in later towards the end as well to share also some insights.
All right. Thank you so much, Nathan. Um, let me just share my screen as well, because I think I've added one or two things that I would want to share.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. Now let us proceed to look at how to effectively write the results section of a scientific manuscript. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat section anytime, and then at the end we can come back to answer them. So one of the most important things to consider when writing a scientific manuscript is to be logical. Remember, you're presenting a scientific dialogue. Like Nathan already mentioned, you're starting from the introduction, giving people a glimpse of what you want to talk about, basically introducing your topic and the gap that your study intends to fill. And then when you come to the methods, you're basically outlining the formula or the methodologies that you're going to apply to address that gap or that question. Now, when we come to the results, we're assuming that we have answered the question. We have our findings. Now, how do we communicate what we found in our study? So in this section, we want to try as much as possible to present information that is readable, clear, as well as objective. And most importantly, make sure that it falls in line with your study objectives. In this section, you're basically giving an answer to your questions. So you don't want to pluck a result out of the sky or out of nowhere and then just bring it in the results section. Make sure that whatever you're reporting here, you have already presented it in the introduction as well as in the methods, telling people how you came to that result. So another important thing to consider here, or let me just mention that one of the common mistakes that I see people commit in the results section is interpreting their findings. Remember, here you're just presenting what you found. It is not in the results section that you interpret your findings. You have all the time under the discussion to give an interpretation to what you found. So here, just stick to the presentation of the results. Now, most of the times when you're reading scientific papers, you find that in the results, there is some text, tables, and figures. Now, how do we present all of these? So, mostly in the results, it is good practice to start with baseline characteristics of your participants or study entities. So after that, you can now move on to your primary and secondary objectives. When you want to bring in the tables and figures, make sure they are not repeating what you've already presented in the text. Tables and figures should complement your text, should simply complement your findings. So you could actually use the text to highlight or perhaps draw attention to what's important in the tables or figures. And make sure that your tables and figures are clearly labeled and they're also referenced in the text. Yeah. And when it comes to reporting numbers, make sure that you're using appropriate units and you're also consistent with your units throughout the manuscript. You don't want to have centimeters somewhere and then you switch to meters at some point. Or even when you're reporting currency, you don't want to have Malawian kwacha somewhere and then you switch to dollars at some point. Make sure that you're consistent. When it comes to qualitative studies, where you have to present themes and sub-themes, make sure that these are also clearly presented and use your quotes sparingly. You don't want to overwhelm your readers with a lot of quotes. Make sure that your quotes are only trying to illustrate some points, not tell the whole story. Yeah. And when you do quantitative studies, you may do some statistical analysis and you may have to report statistically significant results. Make sure that you are clear about those results. And sometimes you may have some results that are not statistically significant, but they are practically meaningful. Make sure that you also highlight those results. They're quite important as well. Yeah. So the bottom line, make sure that you're clear in the results. Be objective and stick to presenting the results, not interpreting them. From there, let's move on to where you can now interpret your findings. That is under the discussion. So in the discussion, you're now at liberty to give interpretations to what you found. One of the common questions that people usually ask is how to go about discussing your findings. So what I'm presenting here, what you're able to see on your screen. So this is from a draft of one of my first write-ups, one of my first manuscripts. when I sent it to one of my supervisors, this is one of the comments that I got. So I found this helpful. I've always used it when writing my discussion section. So I thought it could be of help to some of us as well. So usually in the discussion, before you start interpreting your findings, we need to consider how we're going to interpret them. So you find that most of the writings out there, authors start with a summary of their main findings. So the first paragraph is usually a summary of the answers to their study objectives. Having summarized what they found, in the subsequent paragraphs, they pick a point or they pick one main finding and then they go ahead to discuss it. So they basically answer the following questions when they're interpreting the finding. So the first one is, what is my result in summary? So usually the first sentence is a summary of one of their main findings. Now, it is important that you don't interpret your findings in isolation. When we're interpreting findings in science, we relate them to what other scientists or other researchers have already found. So we need to consider how does my finding align with local, regional, or global data? Or basically, what have other studies found? And then from there, the next consideration would be, why do we have similar or different findings? So the similarities or differences could be brought about by maybe the study population, the methods that have been used, including the sample size, the sampling. Yeah. Now, having discussed the possible causes for those differences and similarities, you now present the implication of your finding. Basically, how does the finding inform further research, policy, or clinical practice? So this is quite an easy guide to that has helped me a lot of times when I'm writing my discussion. Like I mentioned, ensure that you don't discuss your own thoughts. You need to present evidence that other researchers have already found and relate it to your finding. And from the discussion, you need to come to conclusions. So in conclusions, you're basically stating if your study has answered your study objectives. So the point is, make sure that your conclusions are supported by your findings. Don't bring in conclusions from other studies. Make sure that your conclusions are coming from your study. And after conclusions, also it is good practice to include limitations of the study. To say the truth, every study has limitations. So there is no shame in acknowledging the limitations from your study. So you need to make sure that you're actually transparent here. So the limitations from your study can come from perhaps your methods. For example, if your study is purely quantitative, under limitations, you could actually state that the lack of a qualitative aspect prevents you from giving another perspective to the study. And also you could also talk about the generalizability of your findings. So this screen basically just shows one of our papers. So following the same format that I just discussed. So when you look at the first paragraph, that is basically a summary of our findings. So here we just discussed the novelty of our study in the context of Malawi, and then we went ahead to report the main findings from our study. And now in the second paragraph, we followed the format that I just shared. And our discussion section came out nicely, and the reviewers had no issues with it. And it passed with no issues, and we got this paper published. Now, overall, when reviewers are giving their comments to your study, they would look at the appropriateness of your study design. If the methods that you've used were able to address your study objectives and your study aims. And also the second thing they look at is the contributions of your study to already existing literature. And also, like I mentioned, they pay close attention to the major flaws or limitations of your study. So before they come to shoot you on this one, make sure that you're transparent and you mention them and how you've addressed them as well. And finally, they look at the internal consistency of the study. Like I mentioned, be logical from the introduction up to the conclusions. Don't introduce something that you're not going to address in your methods, and don't include a particular method that does and omit the results that you got from there. So make sure that you are consistent. And finally, I know Nathan will also come in on this one. We want to briefly talk about how to pick a journal in which you can publish your study. So for this one, I would say that the best time to pick a journal, the target journal for your study, is before you start writing your manuscript. I'm saying this because journals have different requirements. They have different guidelines. So you want to pick a journal and then go through their requirements and frame your manuscript in line with those requirements. If you face a desk rejection, I mean, you can always reframe it in line with another journal. But I think it's important that you should always have a target journal in mind when you're starting to write your manuscript. So some of the things that you would consider when deciding which journal to pick is the impact factor of the journal. So when we talk of the impact factor, this is simply the number that reflects the number of citations that recent articles from that journal have got. So it's an indication of the visibility of the journal, like how many times people get or cite articles from that journal. And getting that visibility, getting your article cited, that is good for your visibility and growth. So it's important to pick a journal with a good impact factor. But then on this one, let me cautiously say that most of the high-ranking journals, the reputable journals, the journals that have high impact factor, they also have low acceptance rates. So as a beginner, an author who is just starting, make sure that you balance well between picking a journal with a high impact factor and another journal that will increase your probability of being accepted for publication. Yeah, so I think that would be a decision that you may have to make. But I would recommend a journal with a good impact factor. And then also make sure that you choose a credible journal. These days, there's a lot of predatory journals out there. So make sure that the journal that you pick is indexed in scientific databases like Google Scholar, PubMed, Medline, and all these ones that have been listed here. And also make sure that you familiarize yourself with the submission and the review process of the journal. So this is stated in the instructions for authors in your target journal. So make sure you spare some time to go through that. Make sure that you know the submission requirements in terms of their word count, referencing style, and everything. So that will save you a lot of time and you avoid desk rejections. And also for authors that are just beginning, also check the frequency of publication. Make sure that you pick a journal that publishes quite frequently, because you don't want to wait for the whole year or 2 years for your article to come out. So make sure you pick a good journal in that regard. And also make sure that you know the types of articles published by your target journal. That is systematic reviews, original research, policy briefs, commentaries, because you do not want to submit a narrative review to a journal that does not publish those ones. They will reject you, of course, and you waste a lot of time. And another important thing to consider is the publication fees. So you can choose to publish under open access or on the subscription-based journals. So in open access, these journals usually have article processing charges that may range from maybe $500 to as high as $3,000. So in open access, you pay the fee so that readers or others can access your article for free. Whilst in the subscription-based, you do not pay. But anyone who wants to read your article, they'll have to pay to access it, or they'll basically have to buy. So it is important to go for the open access. because that will increase your visibility and it will enable a lot of people to access your article. The good thing is most journals out there, they offer publication waivers to authors, especially those coming from low and middle income countries. And I can testify here that I've never paid an article processing charge. Most of the journals, when you apply for a waiver, they will grant one. And finally, you want to consider the field or discipline covered by the journal. Obviously, you don't want to submit a health-based article to an engineering journal, of course. Yeah. Yeah. But then these are a lot of points, but don't stress when you want to look for a journal. There are tools out there that can help you to select a good journal. Just type on Google Elsevier Journal Finder or maybe Springer Journal Suggester. They will give you a number. So you provide the title or the abstract of your manuscript, and they will suggest a list of journals that could be good for your paper. So yeah, so don't stress on this one. There is always help out there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I think at this moment, Nathan, if you may have a few more things to say, you can chip in. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Akim. There were a number of questions as you are presenting, so I think I can just answer those quickly, and then you also, if you could maybe see also the chat. I'll not manage to answer all of them, but I'll just speak one. So, for instance, there's one here. It says, on the methodology, you talked about making it reproducible, but in random experimental design, the outcome you had might be different to someone else who also runs his own random sampling. How can I come my random sample? How can I make my random sample reproducible for someone else to have the same results? Yeah, so you're right. You cannot have the same results or the same, like everything identical, right? Because if you do that, then there's also no gap to what you have done. But the main point is that if somebody wanted to do the same, right, they will need to maybe do their own sample size, right? Maybe they would also replicate some areas of the experiments. They wouldn't really copy everything, but they would just pick one or two things, which are the principal methodology behind what you're trying to do. So yeah, you cannot do everything 100%, but if somebody is ready, they should be able to say, okay, if I wanted to do this, this is how I can do it. And then the second question says, on methods, you say you need to check if the questionnaire was pre-tested. If I'm working on a data set that was done by someone to produce a manuscript, how do I tell if the questionnaire was pre-tested? So usually in the journal, you usually say, okay, before, as part of the methodology, like you can say the data collection instrument was a structured questionnaire, which was pre-tested by a group of students or maybe by a community somewhere, which was excluded from data analysis. So you can't tell unless either, if that information hasn't been stated in the manuscript, you can write to the corresponding author to ask if that questionnaire was pre-tested. But then, even if it wasn't pre-tested, if you have just adapted it, you can also still pre-test as part of a data collection. Because it might be pre-tested somewhere. Let's say a study was done in Ronga, right? And then you want to do your study in Sanje or Blantyre. So the people might be different. Their understanding levels, you don't know where they collected the data. They might have different education backgrounds and whatnot. So it's very important to pretest every questionnaire because you might find different people. So you can also pretest and then you exclude them from the part of the final analysis. So another question was, is it possible to formulate your own questionnaire, or the right way is looking already for a used questionnaire? So it depends with your study. Some studies, like feels completely new, you might have to design a questionnaire, or you might have to find one which is already there, but you adapt it. So for instance, you might find that maybe you wanted to do a study about HIV. So you find a questionnaire from South Africa. But when you go through it, you might find like maybe some of these questions are not really relevant to Malawian, the Malawian context. You might have to remove those questions and add in more questions which are relevant to Malawi. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean, but you can adapt. And then another question on the results. Do we need to describe all the variables on where you said the results in the text should complement the text? Or would you give an example? So obviously, you can't present all the results from your study. You just pick the ones which are more interesting and more relevant, right? Because your questionnaire might have 23 or 30 questions. You can't present all those in the results. In the results section will be too big. So remember, a manuscript is just like a summary, and usually sometimes there are even word counts limit, maybe up to 5,000 words, maybe 4,000 or 6,000. So it's just like a short summary. But when you're writing, let's say like a thesis or dissertation, that's why you can write in full, like every result on its own. And then finally, I'll just answer this question about sample size in microbiology. So yeah, sample size, there are various ways to calculate it, but there's not a one size which fits all. So for instance, in microbiology, maybe you want to do a culture or you want to do antimicrobial resistance or something, the sample size for that might not be for like how you're doing a questionnaire, right? So what you need to do is do a literature review of how people in that same area have done their sample size calculations. Sometimes you don't need to have a sample size. You can just do convenience. Maybe you say, okay, I'll just do maybe three, especially in the experimental studies. You don't really need like a lot of like samples, or maybe when you're doing molecular biology things, you don't really need, because it's also costly. So might be your budget may not allow you to do maybe to sequence 100 samples. You may just have to do 5 or 10. You see, so the most important thing before you start writing, do your research, right? Read widely. Read a lot of papers. When you read through, when it comes for time to write, it will not be difficult to write. And then another thing I can say is that just start. If you haven't started, just start. When you start, it's different than saying, I'm going to start tomorrow or the other day. When you start, you send somewhere, they'll give you comments. Maybe they'll reject the first manuscript. That's fine. You use those reviewers' comments to help your manuscript get better, and then you can resubmit somewhere else. And then maybe Akim, you can also come in.
Right, thank you, Nathan. One of the questions is let me just get it clearly. There's a question that results and figures should not be included or repeated in the discussion. Would you comment on this? All right, thank you. Yes, like I said, in the results, we're only presenting what we found. In the discussion, we want to interpret our findings. So in the discussion, we should not repeat the results. But then we can state the main finding that we want to interpret. So just give a summary of the main finding that you want to discuss. So it can be a sentence or two. And then you go ahead to relate that finding to previous literature. In so doing, you're not repeating your findings, but you're just paving way for a logical discussion. Another question is you said something about mistakes on where to discuss your results. I would like to believe that I've addressed this one in my previous comment. Yes, so just to repeat, the results should be discussed under the discussion. You can only state the main finding and proceed to discuss it. When you're discussing, relate it to pre-existing literature. Another question. In discussion where you said we need to relate and find differences, how easy can we do this? All right, so like Nathan mentioned, it is important to read widely before you start writing your manuscript. When you're conceptualizing your idea, you do a lot of literature review. Make sure that you keep all those articles. They become handy when you're doing your discussion. And even at the time that you're doing your discussion, you need more papers to complement what you're writing. So you need to find papers that relate to your main findings. And as you're reading those papers, you can find the similarities and the differences in terms of the findings. And that becomes easy. You could just list those similarities and differences and discuss the possible reasons for those similarities and differences. But yeah, it is always important to make sure that you keep your articles presentable from the time that you're doing your literature review, because you still need them when you're doing your discussion. Another question. Is there a recommendation as in how long a manuscript is supposed to be or not? Yes, thank you for that question. So on whether to include recommendations or not, this depends on the journal requirements. You'll find that some journals will ask you to have a section on recommendations. Some journals will not. But it is good practice to include recommendations in your manuscript. It should actually come from the journal that they don't want recommendations in your manuscript, but it's always good practice to include recommendations in your writing. Yeah. And on the word count in the manuscript, this also depends on the journal that you want to publish. Usually on average, the range is 3,500 to around 5,000 or 6,000. But it's actually more than enough. Like Nathan mentioned, a manuscript is basically a summarized version of your study. Actually, from your study, from the same data, you can come up with multiple manuscripts. You could just pick a set of objectives and try to address them in one manuscript, and another set of objectives that will be addressed in another manuscript. So whatever is presented in one manuscript will be targeted to or be linked to those objectives. So yeah. Another question, can you say something on the cover letter needed as part of manuscript submission guidelines? Yes, most of the journals will ask you to write a short cover letter, but this is not difficult. This is actually very simple. In the cover letter, they need you to introduce your manuscript. So basically, you just provide them with the title of your manuscript, and in layman language, non-technical language, why your study is important, or a specific gap that your study is trying to fill. So yes, sometimes most of the journals rather, they require cover letters, but you need not to worry about this one. It's not a daunting task. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if if we have more questions. Over to you, Nathan, if you have any additions.
No, I don't have. Thank you.
All right. Adriano, are you here? All right. I think Adriano is not here. He's not yet here. All right. Thank you. I don't know if we have any more questions. All right. So thank you once again, everyone, for making time to join this webinar. But this was more theoretical. We would love to have a practical session on this one. So we'll make an arrangement for everyone who has a manuscript that needs to be completed or started, so that we schedule some time for a practical session on this one. We give you some guidance on how to proceed with your manuscript. For the time being, if you have any more questions on this one or any other topic, please go ahead to drop them on the group, and then we'll be happy to respond or get back to you as soon as possible. Nathan, if you have any closing remarks, I think it's almost 8. This was supposed to run for an hour. Nathan, can you hear us? If you have any closing remarks or anything to say? All right, all right, that's fine. So once again, thanks everyone. Reaching this point, this is the end of our webinar this evening. Yeah, we'll communicate to you on the arrangements to proceed with the practical manuscript writing sessions. Thank you. You have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.